At exactly the moment everyone thought the clock was about to run out, the clock didn't just pause, it was quietly reset. And almost in the same breath, a second move came in from a completely different direction, Russia reaching out to Iran, signaling it's ready for what comes next. Now, most coverage is treating these as unrelated developments, just another delayed deadline here, just another diplomatic call there. But that reading misses the point entirely. These are not two stories. This is one coordinated moment playing out in pieces, and if you don't connect them, you miss the strategy behind it. So let's walk through this carefully, because what's happening is actually very simple once you strip away the noise. Deadlines don't move without a reason, and timing like this is never accidental. When you line up the delay with the signal that followed, a clear pattern starts to form. And that pattern tells you we're not looking at hesitation. We're looking at repositioning right before the next phase begins. Here's the first thing you need to understand, and it's more deliberate than it looks. Donald Trump didn't just casually speak this morning, he reset the entire frame. In one moment, speaking to Bloomberg, he clearly stated that the ceasefire now expires Wednesday evening. That alone shifts expectations. But then, almost immediately after, in his conversation with PBS, he escalated the tone, saying that if no deal is reached, lots of bombs start going off. And just when that sounds like maximum urgency, he pulls it back in the same breath, saying he feels no pressure, no obligation to close a deal within 6 weeks. Think about that for a second. In a single window of time, he raises the stakes to imminent escalation, then removes any sense of deadline pressure. Urgency is created and neutralized at the same time. The media is reading this as inconsistency, even confusion, but it's not. This is controlled signaling. It's a message designed to land differently depending on who is receiving it. And if you want to understand why what happened next unfolded the way it did, you have to read that signal correctly. Now here's the second piece, and this is where it locks in. Sergey Lavrov got on the phone with Abbas Araqchi, and this wasn't a routine diplomatic check-in. The Russian Foreign Ministry didn't just confirm the call, they published the language. And the language is precise. Russia reaffirmed its unwavering readiness to assist in resolving the crisis, and more importantly, its willingness to facilitate agreements that are acceptable to all sides, particularly between Iran and the Gulf states. That's not vague diplomacy, that's positioning. And then Iran's response completes the exchange, a clear commitment to ensure uninterrupted passage for Russian vessels and cargo through the Strait of Hormuz. This is reciprocity in real time. Russia secures strategic movement through one of the most critical choke points in the world, and Iran secures Russian backing, diplomatic cover for whatever comes next. Two foreign ministers, one call, and both sides walk away with something concrete. Now step back and look at the timing. Trump shifts the deadline and reshapes the pressure dynamics, and within the same 12-hour window, Russia and Iran lock in a coordinated understanding. These are not separate stories. They are two expressions of the same underlying structure playing out in real time. This is exactly the pattern I was pointing to, not as a prediction about a specific morning, but as the inevitable logic of how this situation evolves. The system itself produced both moves simultaneously. And if you don't understand that mechanism, then Wednesday will look like a surprise. But if you do understand it, then what's coming next is not just predictable, it's already in motion. Let me slow this down and walk you through it clearly. What I said, what actually happened over the last 72 hours, and why none of this is random. Because if you only look at the surface events, you'll miss the deeper logic that's driving all of it. I said the deadline would move, and it did. Not because of guesswork, but because every single deadline Donald Trump has set in this conflict has followed the exact same pattern. Each one was tied to a condition. Keep the Strait of Hormuz open, halt nuclear enrichment, force Iran into submission. And every time the deadline arrived, those conditions were still unmet. So the real question is simple. What happens when you draw a line and the other side refuses to cross it? You have two options: enforce the line with consequences that fundamentally change the situation, or quietly redraw the line and buy more time. And what we've seen since February 28th is not inconsistency, it's a repeated choice. Because enforcing that line doesn't mean a limited strike or symbolic escalation. It means stepping into a full-scale conflict with Iran, a country nearly 4 times the size of Iraq, with around 90 million people, mountainous terrain, and decades of preparation specifically designed to absorb and resist invasion. That's not a short war, that's a strategic commitment with no clear exit. And inside the U.S. military chain of command, there is no clean, executable plan for that scenario. So the cost of enforcing the deadline becomes higher than the cost of moving it. And when that calculation repeats itself, the outcome becomes predictable. The deadline moves not as a sign of weakness, but as a function of the system itself. Now here's where the second layer comes in, and this is where most people are not paying attention. I said Russia was positioning itself for this exact moment. Not to fight, not to escalate militarily, but to shape what comes after. Because structurally, Russia's role in this conflict has never been about confrontation with the United States. It's about making itself unavoidable in any resolution. And today, Sergey Lavrov made that positioning explicit. He didn't talk about mediating between Iran and America. He talked about facilitating agreements between Iran and the Gulf Arab states. That distinction matters. It means Russia is stepping directly into the regional framework that will define the post-conflict balance before a deal even exists. This is pre-positioning influence. It's not reactive diplomacy, it's strategic insertion. And at the exact moment when the ceasefire clock is running down, that message is delivered publicly. That's not routine. That's timing with intent. And this is where everything connects. What we're watching is not chaos. It's a system producing outcomes based on incentives and constraints. Russia is executing a strategy I've described before, and today is a perfect example of it in action. I call it the absent profiteer. Russia doesn't need to fire a single shot to benefit from this war. It gains leverage as a mediator, it strengthens its relevance in regional negotiations, and it positions itself as a necessary bridge between competing sides, all while avoiding direct confrontation. So when you line up the moving deadline and the Lavrov call, you're not looking at two separate developments. You're looking at the same mechanism unfolding from two different angles. And once you see that clearly, the bigger picture comes into focus. This isn't just about what happened today, it's about who is shaping what happens next. Let's start with the first layer of this, because it explains why Russia doesn't need to rush anything. When tension around Iran escalated and the Strait of Hormuz became uncertain, global oil markets reacted instantly. Prices surged toward the 120 per barrel range, and that single movement reshaped the economics of the entire conflict. Russia, as one of the world's largest energy exporters, didn't have to act aggressively. It simply had to exist within that moment. And here's the part most people miss. In response to the energy shock, the United States loosened pressure on Russian oil flows to stabilize global supply. In other words, a war that America was trying to contain indirectly increased Russia's revenues, and the system itself created the conditions for that to happen. Russia didn't need to threaten, escalate, or intervene militarily. It stayed aligned with Iran, allowed the crisis to tighten the oil market, and let demand do the rest. The longer uncertainty continues, the longer elevated prices persist, and that translates into millions of extra dollars flowing into Russian coffers every single day. This is what I mean by the absent profiteer. Russia benefits without stepping onto the battlefield. It doesn't need a fast resolution. It needs an outcome that preserves this leverage for as long as possible. Now, move to the second layer, and this is where it becomes even more strategic. Sergey Lavrov made a set of statements in Beijing that most Western coverage treated as background noise. But in reality, they redefined the entire negotiation framework. He made it clear that Russia will accept any nuclear decision that Iran chooses, while also explicitly backing Iran's right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. But more importantly, he revived a very specific offer. Russia is willing to take Iran's highly enriched uranium and reprocess it into fuel for civilian nuclear use. That might sound technical, but it's a massive geopolitical move. Because what United States has consistently demanded is control, removal of enriched material under conditions that reinforce American oversight and influence. Russia's proposal achieves the same technical outcome. The uranium leaves Iran, but completely changes who controls the process. If Iran accepts, the material goes to Moscow, not Washington. That means Russia becomes the long-term custodian of Iran's nuclear capacity, embedding itself directly into Iran's strategic infrastructure for years, potentially decades. And when you step back and think about what that means, the implications are huge. The core issue that has stalled negotiations, whether in places like Islamabad or elsewhere, is the question of control and trust. America wants guarantees tied to its own system of oversight. Iran doesn't trust those guarantees. Russia has now inserted a third path, a solution that satisfies the technical requirements while sidestepping the political surrender. Iran keeps its dignity and avoids handing over leverage to a rival. America can still claim progress if uranium is removed. But Russia walks away with something far more valuable: permanent influence over one of the most sensitive strategic assets in the region. And the timing of this offer matters just as much as the content. By making it public while negotiations are under pressure, Russia is sending a direct signal to Iranian decision makers. There is an alternative, and it doesn't require accepting American terms on the most critical issue. That's not passive diplomacy. That's a calculated move placed exactly where it will have the most impact. Now here's where the counter-argument starts to break down, because when you look closely at what actually happened today, the details don't fit the routine explanation. The call between Sergey Lavrov and Abbas Araqchi introduced elements that go beyond the established pattern in two very here's the third layer, and this is the one most directly tied to what happened today. Russia is not just reacting to events. It is actively positioning itself as the architect of what comes after the war. Look closely at the language coming out of Moscow. It's not focused on negotiations between Iran and United States. Instead, it's centered on Iran's relationships with the Gulf Arab states, countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. That shift in focus matters because those relationships will determine who shapes energy politics in the Persian Gulf for the next generation. This isn't theoretical. Russia already previewed this role when it helped broker the Iran-Saudi rapprochement in 2023, a move that caught Washington off guard. What we're seeing now is the next phase, Russia preparing to broker a broader regional settlement that decides whether Iran comes out of this conflict isolated or reestablished as a recognized regional power with security guarantees from its neighbors. If Russia succeeds in that role, it gains something far more valuable than short-term leverage. It gains long-term diplomatic influence in a region where it historically never dominated. And when you compare that to how America built its position in the Middle East, the contrast is striking. For over 6 decades, the United States relied on military bases, defense agreements, and security guarantees, an approach that has cost trillions of dollars. Russia, by contrast, is building influence through timing, diplomacy, and calculated engagement, one phone call at a time. So when Moscow reaches out and says, "We stand ready," that message isn't about stopping the war in that moment. It's about ensuring that no matter what happens next, whether it's a ceasefire extension, a deal, or a return to conflict, Russia is already embedded in the process. The call that happened today, just before the deadline pressure peaks, is a signal of presence. It's Russia making it clear, whatever table forms after Wednesday, we will be sitting at it. Now here's the critical connection. The reason the moving deadline and the Russia call are not separate stories. They are both expressions of the same structural reality. America cannot resolve this conflict on its own. Not because the pressure isn't real, it is. Shipping disruptions, economic strain, currency decline, those pressures are measurable and significant. But there's a difference between pressure and decisive pressure. And that gap is being filled by external support. Russia benefits economically from prolonged instability through elevated oil prices. China continues to purchase Iranian energy and provides diplomatic cover in global institutions. Together, they create a buffer that prevents Iran from reaching a breaking point where it must accept American terms unconditionally. So when the deadline approaches, it cannot hold in a rigid way, because enforcing it would mean escalating into a phase of conflict that is far more costly, uncertain, and prolonged than what has already occurred. This is why the decision-making on both sides starts to converge. Donald Trump and his military advisors understand the cost of escalation. Russia understands the leverage created by that hesitation. So the deadline moves, not as a retreat, but as a recalibration. And at the exact same moment, Russia steps forward to reinforce its position, knowing that both sides are approaching a point where outside facilitation becomes necessary. Iran needs a way out of the nuclear issue without losing face. Gulf states need a framework that doesn't leave them exposed. America needs to avoid a broader war while maintaining strategic credibility. Russia positions itself as the answer to all three pressures simultaneously and uses that positioning as leverage. Now, to be fair, there is a counter-argument, and it's important to take it seriously. You could say the deadline only moved slightly, not enough to signal a major strategic shift. You could argue that Russia's call was routine, part of an established pattern of communication that has been ongoing since the conflict began. Analysts have tracked multiple calls between Sergey Lavrov and Iranian officials over the past months, and the phrase "stands ready" has appeared in previous statements as well. From that perspective, nothing fundamentally new happened, just another iteration of an ongoing process. At the same time, mixed signals from Iran, conflicting reports about negotiations and attendance at talks suggest that diplomacy is still active, not collapsing. And if back-channel discussions are progressing more than what's visible publicly, then a deal before the next deadline is still possible. That interpretation sees continuity, not escalation. But here's the key difference. Even if each individual piece looks routine in isolation, the timing and alignment of all of them together is what changes the meaning. The deadline shift, the diplomatic messaging, the positioning by Russia, taken separately, they can be explained away. Taken together, they reveal a pattern. And that pattern points to something much larger than a single day's events. It points to how the next phase of this conflict is being shaped before it even begins. Clear, measurable ways. First, Iran didn't just restate a position, it confirmed a specific operational guarantee, the readiness to ensure unimpeded passage of Russian vessels and cargo through the Strait of Hormuz. That's not diplomatic filler language. That's a tangible, real-world commitment with immediate commercial and strategic value. In exchange, Russia reaffirmed its readiness to facilitate outcomes moving forward. This is not just alignment, it's reciprocity. Previous calls were about signaling intent. This call locks in an arrangement. Russia secures reliable access through the most critical energy corridor on the planet, and Iran secures Russian backing at the exact moment when the next phase of this conflict is about to be decided. The second shift is even more consequential. Lavrov's uranium proposal, stating that Russia will accept any decision that suits Iran regarding enriched uranium, is now fully public, sitting directly alongside America's position, which has consistently required Iran to hand over that material under U.S.-aligned terms. This changes the entire negotiation dynamic, because now, for the first time, there is a visible third option on the table. If Iran enters talks knowing that Russia is willing to take custody of the uranium on Iran's terms, then the pressure structure inside that room is fundamentally different. It is no longer a binary choice between compliance and defiance. It becomes a strategic choice between competing external partners, and that option is calibrated perfectly. It gives Iran something Washington's offer does not, a way out that avoids public capitulation. That is not routine diplomacy. That is Russia inserting itself directly into the final stage of negotiations as an alternative pathway on the single most sensitive, unresolved issue. And then there's the silence from United States. No public pushback, no direct framing of Russia's offer as interference. No attempt to reshape the narrative around it. That absence matters. Because in a situation like this, silence is not neutral. It's informative. It suggests one of two possibilities. Either the U.S. is hoping the offer doesn't gain traction, or it has already adjusted to a scenario where Russia plays a role in the final arrangement and is prepared to frame that outcome as a diplomatic success. Either way, that changes what the deadline actually represents. It's no longer just about whether a deal happens, it's about who defines the terms of that deal. At the same time, you're seeing something equally important on the Iranian side. Public statements from leaders Project Defiance, clear messaging that they will not submit to pressure, while reports indicate ongoing diplomatic engagement behind the scenes. That's not contradiction, it's dual-track strategy. Domestic political positioning runs alongside negotiation tactics. It has to, because any agreement that appears externally imposed without internal framing would be politically unsustainable. So what looks inconsistent on the surface is actually a coordinated balancing act. Now step back and connect everything. The moving deadline, the Lavrov call, the uranium offer, and Iran's mixed signals. They're not isolated developments. They're outputs of the same mechanism, a system where no single actor can dictate the outcome alone, and where each player is positioning not just for the deal itself, but for control over what follows. And once you see it that way, the question shifts. It's no longer, will there be a deal? It becomes, what leverage does each side actually bring into that moment? Because here's the reality. If Russia has already given Iran a viable nuclear exit, if it has already positioned itself as the bridge between Iran and the Gulf states, and if the U.S. has already adjusted its own timeline, then the negotiation table itself is no longer what it was even a few days ago. The structure has changed, and that means what happens next won't just be about agreement or disagreement, it will be about whose framework defines the outcome. And this is where it gets even more important. The same mechanism that produced today's events doesn't stop here. It continues forward. It produces patterns, and those patterns lead to observable outcomes. So over the next 48 hours, the focus shouldn't just be on what is announced, it should also be on what isn't. Because in conflicts like this, the most significant moves are often the ones that happen quietly without headlines. And based on how this mechanism has been operating, the next phase is already forming. We just need to watch closely to see how it reveals itself. Let's talk about what happens next, because if you understand the mechanism behind everything we've just discussed, then the next 48 hours are not random. They follow a pattern, and that pattern gives us three very specific expectations. First, Iran will send a delegation to Islamabad, not because trust has suddenly appeared, because it hasn't. Iranian leadership has been explicit that the core issue is not misunderstanding, it's distrust rooted in real recent actions. But diplomacy at this level isn't about trust, it's about cost. And right now, Iran has calculated that the cost of not showing up is higher than the cost of showing up, even if no deal is reached. Reports from outlets like the New York Times, combined with carefully worded statements from Iranian officials, all point in the same direction. The language being used, phrases like taking all aspects into consideration, is not hesitation, it's diplomatic signaling. It allows Iran to attend talks while maintaining the internal narrative that it is acting on its own terms, not under pressure. So the expectation here is clear. Iran shows up, but on its own framing. Second, watch Russia very closely, because Russia is not going to let its position fade from the conversation at the most critical moment. After placing the uranium facilitation offer into the public space, the next logical move is reinforcement. Expect at least one more statement, likely from Sergey Lavrov or the Russian Foreign Ministry, that brings that offer back into focus. The key detail to listen for is any explicit reference to Russia's readiness to handle Iran's enriched uranium as part of a broader settlement. If that language appears again before Wednesday, it's not repetition, it's confirmation. It signals that this is not just a theoretical option, but something already aligned in principle between Moscow and Tehran. And by keeping it visible, Russia ensures that no negotiation can proceed as if that option doesn't exist. It forces the United States to negotiate in a space where Russia is already embedded. Third, and this is the most consistent pattern we've seen so far, whatever happens on Wednesday will be declared a victory by Donald Trump, and within hours, it will be publicly challenged by Iran's foreign ministry. This cycle has repeated itself at every major milestone in this conflict. Announcements are made with confidence and clarity on one side, and then immediately reframed or disputed on the other. So when Wednesday arrives, whether it's a deal, an extension, or a return to escalation, the key is not to focus on the initial statements. The real signal is in the details that follow. What is actually agreed? What is left ambiguous? And where do the two sides diverge in their interpretation? That gap between claims is where the truth usually sits. And when you put all of this together, you start to see the continuity. The same mechanism that produced today's developments, the shifting deadline, the Russia-Iran call, the mixed signals about negotiations, is still in motion. It doesn't stop at one event. It keeps generating outcomes based on the same pressures, incentives, and constraints. So, as we move through the next 48 hours, don't just watch what is announced, watch what isn't. Because in conflicts like this, the most important moves are often the quiet ones. The ones that never make the headline, but quietly shape everything that comes after.